Great. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Tim DelSole. He is a full professor at George Mason University in the Department of Atmospheric, Oceanic, and Earth Science, a senior research scientist at the Center for Ocean, Land, Atmosphere Studies, and serves as co-chief editor of Journal of Climate. His research focuses on how future climate changes can be predicted on timescales from weeks to years, often using multivariate statistics and stochastic turbulence models. So thank you, Tim. Go ahead and please, add anything that I may have missed.
Oh, that's good. And can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and get started then. So the main question I'm going to deal with in this talk is how do you compare ocean variability? So this question has come up in other projects that I'm working on. The main issue is that I want to pool different model simulations together, but there's evidence that some simulations look different than others. And so I would not want to pool models together if they look very different. So to do that, we need to have some basis for deciding whether the variability is the same or different between two models. So now if you approach this question from a statistical point of view, there's basically two approaches you might think of. One is you can compute the autocorrelation function, which I've shown here an example of an autocorrelation function for the AMOC index, and it doesn't matter what index I'm using, from a particular model, from 0 to 25-year lag, and it starts at 1 and it decays. And so one approach you can think of is that you would just compute this autocorrelation function between different models and have some measure of the difference between these two. So that's one measure. And another approach is that you can compute a power spectrum, which I've indicated here on the right. This is drawn, again, from the AMOC index from a particular model, but it doesn't matter how I define that index or what model I'm using. It's just an example. And the idea is I can compute this power spectrum for different models and then apply some kind of test for differences in power spectra. So there are tests for that, but there are problems with those tests. So one is that the number of parameters you have to estimate is relatively large. So if I go back to the autocorrelation function, here I'm estimating 25 different lags. So that's 25 different numbers I have to estimate. And in the power spectrum, you have the same problem. You have a certain amount of power for each spectral band, and then you have to compare that across models. So there's a lot of parameters you have to estimate. And there's a general rule that in statistics, the more parameters you estimate for a fixed sample size, the larger the error bars, the larger the uncertainty. And so we would like to try to minimize the number of things we have to estimate. Another problem that actually I struggled with for a long time is there's no systematic procedure for diagnosing differences. So if I go back to the power spectrum, for instance, the integral of the power spectrum is just the variance. So you could have two time series that have exactly the same shape for the power spectrum, but their variance differs. And so that would just mean that one is offset from the other in the vertical direction in this figure. But when you apply this difference in power spectrum test, it doesn't tell you that. It just says there's a difference. You don't know where it is. So what I'd like is some method that not only would diagnose, not only tell me if there's a difference in variability, but what kind of difference is there. Another problem also is that time series are serially correlated. So I can estimate a power spectrum, but then, or actually if I go back to the autocorrelation function, I estimate these lag correlations. But if the lag correlation takes a long time to decay, then those samples are not independent, and so that affects my degrees of freedom. So I'm going to try a totally different approach. And what I'm going to do now is instead of looking at the autocorrelation function or the power spectrum, I'm going to fit the data, the time series to an autoregressive model, and I'm going to do that for the two different time series that I have, and then apply a test of whether the coefficients of those two AR models is the same. So here, A is my label for one time series, and B is the label for the other time series. And so if I fit an autoregressive model is of this form, where the present is some linear combination of the past plus a random noise. And so for each of these models, there's a set of parameters. There's the phi parameters that control the autocorrelation function, and then there's a variance for the noise. And so if the two time series come from the same stochastic process, that basically means that all of these parameters are the same. So I've written that down over here. So each of the phi parameters are the same, and then the variance between of the noise in the two models is the same. So now the advantage of this is that I've drastically reduced the number of parameters I'm estimating. So here, if I only need an AR2 model, then I just have 3 parameters of the 2 phi parameters and just the noise. So that's a pretty good reduction in the number of parameters I have to estimate. And then I can exploit standard hypothesis tests. So this test of whether 2 regression models are equal to each other or not is a standard test in other fields. It's not something that we do in the climate community very much, but it is a standard test. And then the parameters have a physical interpretation. So if it's an AR1 model, the phi is just the lag1 correlation. So it's an immediate interpretation in terms of the sort of the dynamics of the system. But this approach does assume that the time series, that this autoregressive model is a good fit for the time series. And for the data I'm going to use, it turns out this is a pretty good approximation. So now, how do we do this difference in parameter test? Like I said, it's a standard test. I'm not going to go through the details, but you use something called the likelihood ratio test to do this. And it gives you a complicated function to test, but if you assume that the sample size for the 2 time series is the same, and ignore little correction factors for degrees of freedom, it can be written in this form, which is a ratio. The sigma A and sigma B are referring to the noises in the 2 AR models, and then this delta parameter is a measure of the difference in phis. And it's a complicated function, but it doesn't matter. It's just some measure of the difference in phis. So it may not look like this is a measure of the difference in 2 models, but it really is. So in particular, if there's no difference in phis, then this delta goes to 0. And then if these sigmas are the same, you can show that this is equal to 1. And then if delta is anything besides 0, then this ratio will be less than 1. And you can also show if there's any difference in these sigmas, this lambda would also be less than 1. So basically this measure is 1 only if the parameters are equal, and is less than 1 if they're different. So it's a measure, this is a measure of the difference between 2 autoregressive models. Now I like measures where the difference increases with the parameter, so whereas this is sort of inverse to that. So I'm going to define something called divergence, which is the negative the logarithm of this ratio. And so whenever this divergence is large, that means there's a large difference in parameters. So now I'm going to evaluate this with data. So I'm going to look at CMIP-5 pre-industrial control simulations. I'm going to look at the last 500 years of these simulations. I'm going to look at the AMOC index from these simulations. So here I'm defining it as the maximum stream function at 40 degrees north. I'm only looking at the annual means of the AMOC index. So that means when I say lag 1, it's a 1-year lag. And then for each of the control runs, I removed the second order polynomial in time to deal with or remove the climate drift. So here is a snapshot of the time series for I have 10 different model simulations here. And then the goal is, can I apply this test to distinguish these different time series? And now just by looking at these time series, you can kind of guess where the major differences are. So for instance, you can kind of tell that the MPI models, let's see, I'm going to try this arrow. Yes, so like these MPI models have larger variances than the other models. So you would hope that this test would be able to distinguish that. Another difference that you might see when you glance is that there seems to be more high-frequency noise in the INM-CM model, whereas the NOR-ESM model tends to have more low-frequency variability, and you would hope that this test would be able to distinguish those. To do this, we need to know what order autoregressive model we should use. Here I'm going to use a standard diagnostic called AIC, which stands for Akaki Information Criteria. It's a standard statistic, and the idea is you just plot this as a function of the order of your autoregressive model. And where it minimizes is the order that you would select. And so I've indicated the minimum by putting an error bar on that. And you see in most cases, AR1 would hit, or AR2 would do pretty well. Here, this INM model has a selection around 7, but this error bar also shows that actually all the AIC with all these orders are all effectively the same. And so that you could get by even with an AR0 model in this case. So really what we pay attention to is whether there's a difference in AIC that's larger than its error bar. And by that rule, you would really select an AR1 or an AR2. And in this case, actually, it is better to slightly overfit the model than to underfit. If you underfit it, then that means there's some type of variability you're not really fitting with the model. Whereas if you overfit, you're capturing the variability. You might be overfitting a little bit, but that is also taken into account in our statistics test. So it's better to overfit here. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to show you the results where I fix all the models to AR2. So I did that, and I got pretty positive results. And I really wanted to sort of convince myself that it really was working. So I did something a little interesting. I'm going to get a little marker here. So I took these time series, and I split them in half. And the question I had was, if I fit the AR model to the first half of each of these runs, could I infer which model the second half came from, looking only at the time series? All right, so just to be clear, what I'm doing is I'm estimating the AR model on the first half, and then I want to see if I can detect whether the second half came from the same model or from a different model. So the results are shown here. So the vertical axis here is showing the divergence measure. Each number is indicating a model. And then on the x-axis, I pick a model. It tells me which model is my reference for comparing to other models. So here, this is model 1, so that's the Canadian model. And then, by the way, this horizontal dashed line is a significance level. So anything that has a high divergence here says that model is significantly different from the Canadian model. And then everywhere where there's a dot, that's where I'm indicating the model compared to itself. And so what you see in this figure is the dot is always below the significance line. So that means that you cannot tell, there's not a significant difference in the AR models from the first half to the second half from the same model. So that's success. What you also see is that there are some models that the Canadian model, for instance, would not be able to distinguish itself from. So in this case, it's models 8 and 10. And that's the two in-car models, CCSM and CESM. And if I remind you what these time series look like, here's the Canadian model. And then the CCSM model is this third guy here. And if you quickly go from this third one and the bottom one, it would be pretty, if I were to show you those two time series, it would be pretty hard for you to distinguish those two time series. So you can understand why this test had a difficulty distinguishing those time series. And it also said it couldn't tell the difference from the CESM run. And so you can go through each of these columns and sort of go back and forth with the curves and kind of rationalize why the AR model was able to distinguish certain cases and not others. So the second test is instead of splitting it in half, I'm just going to use all the data and then compare the time series using the full data set. And then here's the results for that. And so here, there's no dots because when you compare a model to itself using the same time series, the divergence is exactly 0. So no need to plot that. But now you see in the Canadian model, for instance, it could tell the difference. It cannot distinguish CCSM, but now it emerges here that it can distinguish the CESM. And so you can go through each of these columns. I'll explain these results better shortly. But I wanted to take a few cases and look at them very closely. So here I'm showing the autocovariance function of all the separate models. The model I'm using for comparison is highlighted differently from the others. That's this black curve with the dots. And then if it's pink, that means that this test could tell that those autocovariances are different from the Canadian model. And the gray curve here means it could not distinguish that covariance function from the Canadian model. And you can see in this case, the gray and the black are almost on top of each other. So it's totally reasonable to say that it would be virtually impossible to tell the difference between those two curves within sampling error. Whereas all the pink curves, this test could tell these models were different. But it's not always that simple. If you look at the MPI model, so this colored curve with dots, that's showing the autocovariance function for MPI, and the pink ones are the ones that it can tell the difference from, and then the gray is showing the autocovariances that were indistinguishable from the MPI. And so what's interesting here is that there's this pink curve in between, which this test says is significantly different from MPI. It's significantly different, even though if you were to do some kind of mean squared difference in autocovariance, that would be the closest one. So then how am I sure that this test is working, since it seemed to skip over this one and declare that these two models were the closest? Well, it turns out those two models are the other two MPI models. So I can show that here. So again, here's the MPI model that I was just showing. And then this top one and these two blue curves are showing the other two MPI models. And the one that's in between is NOR ESM. So this test was able to distinguish the two MPI models, even though if you were to do a mean squared difference, the NOR ESM model would actually be closer to the MPI model. So the reason there's a difference is because you see there's a kink after the first lag. And that kink means something important in terms of the autocorrelation structure that this test is able to distinguish. And you see for the NOR ESM model, there's no kink. Okay, so now I'm not really a fan of this particular way of showing all the results. I'd like to have some better way of identifying clusters, for instance. So here you can kind of see there's kind of a cluster here with model 6 cannot be distinguished from 4 and 5. But if you looked at model 4, it was only model 6 that it can't be distinguished, but 5 could be distinguished. So I wanted to have some kind of visual way of illustrating all these results. So just taking a break for a second, imagine you had 3 points on a plane, and you just record the pairwise distance for each of those points. And when you collect that, you can collect that into a matrix. So that's what I've done here. So the diagonal elements of this matrix are 0, because when you compare a point to itself, you get 0 distance. And then for every pairwise distance, that's an off-diagonal element here. So that means all the pairwise differences, no matter how many points I have, I can always collect all those pairwise differences into a matrix. Now, the question I have is, can I go backwards? If you're given the distance matrix, can you figure out the points that gave rise to that distance matrix? In a way, this divergence measure is just a measure of difference. So if I think of it in terms of geometric difference, my question is, can I find a diagram where each of these points were sort of a model in some abstract space that summarizes all these pairwise different divergences? So the answer is yes, I can go backwards. This is a procedure called multidimensional scaling. It's a pretty interesting approach. I think I've said all this. So I can go ahead and apply this approach. And this is the answer I get out of this approach. So there's 2 coordinates here, and these coordinates are just abstract coordinates. The point of this is that every pairwise difference here in this figure matches all the pairwise differences that I plotted or indicated in this figure here. So if we go back, for instance, and recall that the Canadian model could not be distinguished from CCSM, but it could from these other models. Go back to that scatter diagram. Here's the Canadian model, and here's CCSM. So there are 2 points that are close to each other, but then CSM is much further away, so it could tell the difference there. And what I've put here is a circle. So if I remind you that there's a significance line here, sorry. So in 2D, a significance line, when you think of distance, that's just a circle. So I didn't put a circle for every point. I'm just putting one circle just to indicate what that standard, what that radius would be. And if you could compare this to the other figure, you can rationalize how each of these distances work out in terms of that other figure. And so this is a nice feature because now you can instantly see where there are any clusters. So you can see the MPI models form their own cluster. Turns out INM is a cluster on itself. It is unlike all the other models. And the NOR-ESM model was similar to MRI, but different from the other models. And so you can see all that immediately from this figure. So this is a nice kind of way of visualizing differences in variability between these models. Okay, so this is my last slide. This is a summary of what I just said. So it's a short talk, so I don't think I need to repeat all this. So I think I'll just stop there now. I will take any questions.
Great, thank you, Tim. So as a reminder, everyone is on mute right now. So if you have any questions, you can either use the raise your hand feature in ReadyTalk and I will take you off mute, or you can also type in the chat box and I will ask it for you. Looks like Shane has a question. Let's see. All right, go ahead, Shane.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So if you were to do a eigen decomposition of the cross-covariance matrix of all the time series, would you get similar type of information on how to group the different models, or would that give you different type of information?
So I'm not sure the thing you were just now saying. Your eigen decomposition of.
If you were to calculate the cross-covariance matrix of all these time series.
So
right?
then you would be doing an SVD maybe, since it's
yeah,
not.
you would be doing, an SVD of that cross-covariance matrix, and then you would see how that would be also sort of a way of clustering the time series together into modes, telling you how alike a couple of time series are. I don't know. It's just an idea.
Right.
I was wondering if you must have tried that.
Yeah. So it's hard to interpret results like that. So if you remember, when you compute the eigenvector, you're just maximizing the sum square difference, or sum squares of some linear combination.
Yep.
So you may find groups that way, or you may think that you can find a group with the first vector, but then the second vector will also involve loadings for the different models, and then it becomes very difficult to figure out how they should be grouped when you look at the individual eigenvectors.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, any other questions for Tim? See, Dan has a question. Let me come. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the interesting talk, Tim. I was wondering if you could comment on the prospect of including actual observations of the physical system in this sort of distance metric.
Yep. So I didn't include observations here because there are none for AMOC. I hope I didn't offend anybody there. But I have done this already for Atlantic SSTs. And so there we do have observations. And observations would just be considered another model. So there's no special glitch about that. You just include it, and then it'll emerge naturally.
I guess in particular, do you think that we can estimate these autoregressive parameters given the short time series that we have of those properties from observations?
Well, you can always estimate them, and then there's an issue of how confident you are. The nice thing about this approach, which I went a little too fast, so I missed one point. So not only is there a likelihood ratio test that gives you like a measure of the difference, but by taking this negative log of the likelihood ratio, then there's a theorem that says that these differences would have a chi-square distribution. So that gives you an objective way of knowing how far apart they have to be before they're significant. So if you have a smaller data set, then of course that will change that significance level. But that's actually not the biggest challenge with using observations. The biggest challenge is that there's a forced signal in observations. So if you think about the Atlantic, there's this whole Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And there's a question whether that's forced or unforced. And so if you remove that thinking it's forced, you get a different answer than if you think it's internal variability. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So Marlos has a question that he typed in the chat. He asked, you used only control simulations in this work. For forced responses, would this methodology be the same?
So the answer is no, because it would include the forced response. And if you think of that forced response being a trend, that will dramatically influence your AR parameters. Technically, you could go ahead and just do it anyway, right? And even if there's a trend, but then that raises the question of whether you're doing something sensible, because you kind of know that the AR model is not the governing population model for these time series. So really, there has to be a more careful analysis where you account for that forced response, and then how you do that is still something I'm thinking about. But the main idea is that you somehow remove that by some filtering procedure.
And then Wilbert has a question for you. Go ahead, Wilbert.
Tim, very, very nice talk. Thank you for presenting this. So how will you know if a time series has a truly oscillatory component in it? How will it affect the analysis here? And did you come across any time series that had purely oscillatory behavior in it?
Okay, so if you have an oscillatory time series, that is something that can be modeled by an AR model, but you need a higher order than one. So AR2 could get that, or you may need higher orders. But in general, whatever oscillatory time series you have, my expectation is that you could find an AR model that would fit that. And then did I find that? I found no, I did not. But one thing I should tell you, I only showed 10 models here. Those were the 10 models in the CMAP5 archive that had the stream function for the ocean. So there exists some stream function for the other models, but it's not part of the CMAP5 archive. So I know the GFDL model tends to show a pretty strong oscillatory signal, but that's not included here because it wasn't part of the stream function archive in CMAP5.
Okay. Can I just follow up on that, just for my education, I suppose? So if you do a principal oscillation pattern analysis, you also base your dynamical model on an AR1 process, right? So how is it that you are able to get an oscillatory information out of that kind of analysis?
So the POP analysis is a sort of a multivariate generalization of this. So here I'm looking at just two time series, or in each time series I'm fitting to one model. So it's a univariate AR model. POP analysis is a multivariate generalization, and that's how you can get oscillations out of that, because you have multiple variables that are coupled to each other, and that allows you to get an oscillation. A comment I'd like to make, though, is that this analysis can be extended to POP analysis. So we could use this to ask the question, are two POP models or two LIM models different between two simulations?
Oh, fascinating. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So does anyone else have a final question for Tim? All right. So I don't see any additional questions. So I want to thank you, Tim, for presenting your talk today, and thank you for everyone on the line right now who participated with this. We really appreciate you taking the time and informing everyone about your research, Tim. So we will have a posting of your presentation on our US CLIVAR YouTube channel by early next week. So stay tuned for it. Again, thank you everyone for participating.